What would you do if you were asked to help someone who had spent years searching for a loved one, only to discover that their brother had been a victim of dark experiments during the war? When a mysterious woman with glowing skin and haunting silver eyes appears on a quiet street corner, she isn't just seeking help, she's seeking redemption and a path to reunite with her lost brother. But the truth she's uncovering will not only change her life, but the protagonists as well. Secrets, betrayal, and a quest for justice intertwine in a story that will challenge everything they thought they knew about right and wrong. Will they take the risk to help, or walk away from the secrets that threaten to consume them all? The first time I saw her, I dismissed it as a mere trick of the light. It was early morning, and I was walking down Brilliant Street on my way to work, my thoughts consumed by the usual morning haze. But then, just at the edge of my vision, something caught my eye, a faint shimmer near the old alley, almost as if the air itself had shifted. At first, I thought it was a reflection, some play of the sun's early light against the cool shadows of the alley. Yet, the image lingered longer than I expected. When I turned my head, I saw a tall figure standing completely still. She was unlike anyone I'd ever seen, tall and graceful, with pale, translucent skin that seemed to glow softly under the weak morning sun. Her silver eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had paused. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze was unwavering, locked onto me as if she were studying me or waiting for something. Despite how strange it was, I tried to shake off the unease that crept up my spine. Aridia City was full of oddities, especially with the influx of alien species blending into human society after the peace accords. The city was a melting pot, teeming with diverse beings from all corners of the galaxy, so it wasn't entirely unusual to see someone, or something, out of the ordinary. Yet, something about this encounter felt different, as if I was witnessing something I couldn't quite comprehend. I continued on my way, deciding that whatever it was just another curiosity in a city known for its diversity. But the image of the woman lingered in my mind, and a part of me couldn't shake the strange feeling that I had just witnessed something important, or perhaps unsettling. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing to be worried about. After all, I had a full day of work ahead of me, and such oddities weren't worth dwelling on. Little did I know, that first encounter was only the beginning of something much deeper and more mysterious. Over the next few days, I saw her again. It was the same spot near the old alley, just like the first time, except now, there was no denying that something was off. Each morning as I walked to work, she was there, standing perfectly still, her large silver eyes watching me with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. I tried to dismiss it at first. Perhaps I had simply missed her the day before, or maybe she was just another stranger passing through the city. But as the days went by, and I saw her every morning without fail, I couldn't shake the growing sense that I was being watched, that there was some purpose to her presence. She never moved, never spoke. Each time I passed by, her gaze never wavered, as if she were waiting for something. It wasn't threatening, at least not overtly, but there was something unsettling about it. The stillness in which she stood, the way her silver eyes seemed to pierce through me, made it impossible to ignore her. It was as though time stood still in those moments, with nothing but her unwavering stare and the faint shimmer of her translucent skin in the morning light. It became a routine, something I couldn't avoid, yet couldn't understand. She was always there, always watching, like some strange, silent sentinel whose purpose was not clear to me. It wasn't just the repetition of her appearances that unsettled me. It was the feeling that I was somehow being drawn into something beyond my comprehension. I'd walked the same path every morning for years, never once encountering something so strange, so out of place. Aridia City, for all its diversity and strange sights, had never presented anything quite like this before. I found myself questioning whether I was simply imagining things or if I was truly being watched. And if so, why? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more to her presence? Something I couldn't yet understand? By the end of the week, my thoughts were consumed with her. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps she was just another displaced alien trying to adjust to city life. Or maybe I was just overthinking it. But no matter how I tried to push it aside, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Each day she was there, standing in the same spot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. Either I would continue to let this bizarre encounter slide, or I would finally confront it. Something in me told me I needed answers. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a deep sense that this woman, standing so still in the early morning light, was part of something I couldn't ignore. By the 7th morning, I couldn't ignore the strange pull she had on me anymore. Her presence had grown too familiar, yet too unsettling, and I found myself walking toward Brillium Street with a mix of anticipation and dread. Each morning she stood there, her unblinking silver eyes trained on me as I passed. But today something felt different. The need to understand why she was there, why she had been watching me every single morning, overtook my usual indifference. Curiosity had gotten the better of me, and the fear that had been building inside me over the past few days was now tempered with a sense of determination. I stopped in my tracks and turned to face her directly. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I tried to sound braver than I felt. "Were you following me?" I called out, my voice steady despite the nerves that were building inside me. For a long moment, she didn't move, just stood there, her large eyes still locked onto mine, studying me. There was hesitation in her posture, as though she was uncertain whether to approach or not, unsure of how I would react to being addressed. But then, with slow and deliberate steps, she emerged from the shadows, her presence even more striking up close. Her skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of the early morning, and the intensity of her gaze felt even more profound. She didn't answer my question immediately, but her expression revealed something I hadn't expected, a mix of fear and longing, emotions that seemed to tug at me. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice melodic and tinged with sadness. There was no defensiveness, no anger, only a quiet remorse in the way she spoke. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Her voice was almost fragile, as though she were walking on the edge of something too delicate to break. I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. There was no aggression, no hostility, yet something about her made my mind race. "Then why are you here?" I asked, my tone more accusatory now, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "Why do you keep watching me?" I couldn't understand it. This strange woman standing in the same spot every day, her gaze following me as if I were the focus of her entire existence. I had 1,000 questions, and yet no answer seemed to come. She looked away at my words, clasping her hands nervously in front of her as if they were betraying the uncertainty within her. I could see the hesitance in the way she moved, the way she held herself, as though waiting for some sort of approval to speak further. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she finally spoke. "I didn't know how else to approach you," she said, her eyes casting downward as if ashamed. There was a deep sadness in her tone, a weight I hadn't anticipated. She paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "I need your help." The words hung in the air, almost too quiet for me to hear clearly, but they sent a shiver through me. I had no idea what kind of help she was talking about, but the raw desperation in her voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a request made lightly. Something in her eyes, some unspoken urgency, made me realize that whatever this was, it was far more serious than I could have imagined. And for the first time since meeting her, I found myself wondering who this woman really was, and what it was she truly wanted from me. As she spoke those first few words, the weight of her presence became even more profound. I could see her hands trembling, her silver eyes glistening with a mixture of fear and something else. Hope, perhaps. She had come to me for help, though I had no idea why she believed I could provide it. Her voice faltered as she continued, her gaze shifting nervously, as though she feared my response. Her next words would change everything. "My name is I," she said, the name soft on her lips, carrying a sense of longing and uncertainty. "I come from the Zenari colony." She paused, her expression clouded with emotion. "I've been looking for someone who can help me find him." The moment she spoke those words, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something in her tone, the way her voice wavered between hope and despair, told me this wasn't just a simple request. This was something urgent, something life-altering. It took me a moment to fully process what she had said, and even then, my confusion was palpable. "Your brother?" I asked, unsure of what she meant. She nodded, the silver light in her eyes dimming slightly as she spoke again. "Yes, my brother," she repeated, her voice catching. "He was taken by humans years ago, during the war. He was experimented on." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to take a step back to fully absorb what she had said. The rumors of inhumane experiments on alien prisoners during the war had circulated for years, but hearing it from someone directly affected made it all too real. I knew about the Zenari, a peaceful alien species that had been caught in the crossfire of human conflict, but the idea of such atrocities being committed against them made my stomach churn. Her brother, someone she had clearly loved, had been taken, experimented on, and now, years later, she was standing in front of me, desperately seeking answers, hoping I could help her find him. I was struck by the weight of her words, by the profound sadness that seemed to pour from her. I tried to mask my shock, to make sense of it all. "Where is he?" I asked quietly, my voice softer now, unable to mask the gravity of the situation. I looked at me, her expression pleading, and for a moment, I could see the deep, unspoken ache in her eyes. The pain of not knowing where her brother was, the uncertainty of whether he was even alive. "I traced him to this city," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know where to go from here." At that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just about a stranger watching me from a distance. This was about a person in desperate need, someone who had been through unimaginable suffering and was now clinging to the hope that someone, anyone, could help her. Her story, raw and heartbreaking, shifted something in me. I could no longer see her as just an odd figure standing in the alley. I saw her as a person with a past, a person with a cause, and a person with a mission that I couldn't turn away from. In that instant, I knew I had to do something. The need to help her, to make right the wrongs that had been done to her brother, overwhelmed me. I couldn't turn my back on this. Her plea for help, her willingness to trust a complete stranger, it struck a chord deep within me. I couldn't ignore it. So, despite my doubts, despite the danger of getting involved, I found myself agreeing to help. The decision was made, and I would never be the same again. After I agreed to help, the gravity of what I had just committed to settled heavily on me. The research facility where I worked, Arcadia, was no small operation. It was one of the most prominent scientific establishments in the city, tasked with everything from medical research to technological development. The confidentiality surrounding its projects was ironclad. Violating that secrecy could cost me more than just my job. It could destroy my career and possibly my life. But Ice's plea, her desperation, weighed on my conscience, and despite the risks, I began my investigation. The first few nights were a blur of activity, filled with careful planning and quiet determination. I spent hours sifting through files, both physical and digital, searching for anything that could point to the whereabouts of Ice's brother, Kale. I knew that even a small slip-up in the search could alert the higher-ups, and once that happened, it would be game over. So, I had to be cautious, methodical in my search. I used encrypted databases to dig deeper into the facility's history, knowing that anything involving the war, the Zenari, or experimentation would be buried under layers of secrecy. It was slow going, but I was determined to find something, anything that could help. What I uncovered was far worse than I had imagined. The records I found detailed gruesome experiments conducted on captured Zenari, documenting their suffering and the twisted procedures they had undergone. These weren't isolated incidents either. There were systematic reports on multiple Zenari subjects who had been subjected to horrific treatments, their lives sacrificed in the name of research and progress. I could feel the bile rising in my throat as I read through the documents. The faces of these alien beings reduced to little more than numbers on a page, their humanity stripped away for the sake of science. But it was the recurring name in the files that struck me the hardest: Kale, Ice's brother. Kale's name appeared in file after file, indicating that he had been a subject of interest to the researchers for years. The further I dug, the more horrifying the discoveries became. He wasn't just another casualty of the war. He had been kept alive, frozen in stasis, and experimented on for an extensive period. It was chilling to think about what he had endured, the unimaginable horrors that had been done to him. There were also cryptic references to a secret facility located just outside the city, a place that seemed to house the most sensitive and classified experiments. I knew then that this was where Kale was being held. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea how I would take the news, but it was clear now that her brother was alive, and the truth of what had been done to him was buried within that hidden facility. When I shared this information with her reaction was immediate. At first, she didn't speak. She just stood there, her silver eyes wide, the flood of emotions too overwhelming for words. Then, the tears came, silent and uncontrollable, as the realization that her brother was not only alive, but had been subjected to unimaginable torture set in. Her fragile hope flickered to life, and the sense of relief in her expression was palpable. Despite the sorrow, I could see the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes, the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be reunited. For her, it wasn't just about the truth. It was about reclaiming the family she had lost, about rescuing her brother from the nightmare that had been forced upon him. The weight of her emotion was enough to galvanize me further, to push me into action. Together, we made a plan to infiltrate the secret facility and retrieve Kale. It was dangerous, far more dangerous than anything I had done before, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something that was bigger than my own safety or career. I had to help her, and I would do whatever it took to bring her brother home. The decision to infiltrate the secret facility was both reckless and necessary. The night we chose to execute our plan, the air felt thick with tension. The facility was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden away from prying eyes, surrounded by high security, and guarded by state-of-the-art surveillance systems. It was a place where the government kept its most secretive and controversial projects, and getting inside without alerting anyone was going to take careful preparation and flawless execution. I spent the days leading up to the heist preparing ourselves. We gathered as much intel as we could, scouring old maps, studying security footage, and plotting out the layout of the building. The research facility security was notoriously tight, with cameras placed in nearly every corner and automated systems that could detect even the faintest disturbance. Every step we took had to be calculated. I had no intention of getting caught, but I also knew the risks. If we were discovered, everything would be over before it had even begun. When the night of our mission arrived, we moved under the cover of darkness. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as we approached the facility, the distant hum of the city barely reaching us over the deafening silence. We avoided the main entrance, instead sneaking through a hidden service gate on the far side of the compound. I led the way, her movements smooth and practiced despite the uncertainty in her expression. She had been to this place before, though never as a visitor. I could see the way her eyes darted around, alert to every sound, every shadow. She was desperate, but she was also determined. This was the moment she had been waiting for. As we crept through the building's corridors, the weight of what we were doing began to settle on me. It wasn't just about finding Kale anymore. It was about exposing the truth of the horrors hidden within these walls. We knew that once we entered the facility, we would be racing against time. The longer we stayed, the higher the risk of being caught. Every minute we spent searching for Kale was a minute closer to triggering alarms that could end in disaster. But the thought of the experiments, of the countless victims who had suffered in silence, propelled me forward. We moved past rows of locked doors and security checkpoints, using a combination of hacking devices and sheer will to avoid detection. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the rush of adrenaline pushing me forward as I followed down dark, sterile hallways. Every footstep seemed too loud. Every corner seemed to hold a new danger. But I kept moving, her eyes focused, her resolve unshaken. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. Finally, we reached the deepest part of the facility, the place that I had only read about in the encrypted files. It was here that Kale was being kept, in the farthest corner of the building, in a restricted area so secretive that it wasn't even listed on most of the facility's internal maps. There, behind thick, reinforced glass, we found him. Kale's body was suspended in a glowing liquid, his features pale and lifeless, the faintest twitch of movement betraying that he was alive, but barely so. Ice's reaction was immediate. She rushed toward the glass, her face a mix of disbelief and joy, her hands pressed against the cold surface as she whispered his name. The sight of Kale, so close yet so unreachable, broke my heart. There he was, the brother she had spent years searching for, but still trapped in a world of darkness and pain. I could see Ice's hands trembling as she traced the contours of the glass, her voice breaking with emotion. This was it. This was the moment she had dreamed of for so long. But we couldn't stay there forever. The security systems wouldn't let us. I knew that if we didn't act fast, our entire mission would collapse in on us. It took everything I had to override the system's security protocols. The process was excruciatingly slow, each click of a button seeming like it would alert someone to our presence, but I had no choice. I couldn't leave without him. Finally, with a soft hiss of air, the chamber door opened, and Kale was free. But he wasn't in any condition to stand on his own. As soon as the door released, he collapsed into Ice's waiting arms, weak and barely conscious. Seeing them together, in that moment, I realized just how much this mission meant. It wasn't just about rescuing one person. It was about righting a wrong that had been committed years ago. It was about restoring a bond that had been torn apart by cruelty and betrayal. As I cradled her brother in her arms, her tears fell freely, but they were tears of relief. They had found each other again, and that was all that mattered. The moment the stasis chamber opened, the true magnitude of our mission hit me with full force. Kale, though still alive, appeared fragile, weakened by the years of experimentation and isolation. His body had been suspended in that glowing liquid for so long, and now, as he was freed, it was clear that the toll it had taken on him was immense. The process of defrosting his body was more than just physical recovery. It was a raw, emotional moment, especially for I. As the cold, mechanical systems hissed and the chamber doors slowly unlocked, Ice's reaction was immediate. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the glass, her silver eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. She had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her brother, so close and yet still unreachable behind the glass. Her voice cracked as she whispered his name, a soft, desperate sound that seemed to echo in the sterile silence of the room. She pressed her palm against the glass, her yearning and relief radiating off her like a wave. At that moment, nothing else mattered to her. The entire world could have disappeared, and it wouldn't have fazed her. Kale was here, and she had found him. When the chamber finally opened, the scene was raw and intense. Kale collapsed into Ice's arms, weak and disoriented, his body clearly not used to being out of stasis. His skin was pale, his movements sluggish, as if the years of captivity had drained him of all strength. For a moment, there was a tense silence as I caught him, her hands supporting his fragile form. But her voice was the one that broke the silence. She whispered his name again, this time with an overwhelming tenderness, as she held him close, her arms wrapped around him protectively. She had fought so long and hard for this moment, and now it was finally here. The man she had spent years searching for was in her arms again, and it was more than just a physical reunion. It was a healing of a deep, emotional wound. Seeing Ice's relief and joy, I stood back for a moment, observing the scene. I had done it. I had helped reunite a family torn apart by cruelty and injustice. The weight of the decision I had made earlier, to defy the laws of the facility and risk everything for I, suddenly seemed trivial compared to the magnitude of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't just a mission for me anymore. It had become something personal. I was no longer an observer. I was a part of this healing process. But as I watched I hold her brother, there was a deep realization that it wasn't just about rescuing Kale physically. This was the restoration of a broken bond, the rekindling of a relationship shattered by years of separation and suffering. The emotional weight of it all settled heavily on me as I silently watched the siblings embrace. There were no words exchanged for a long moment. It was as though the only thing needed was the comfort of proximity, the feeling of each other's presence after so much time apart. The connection between them was palpable, raw, and undeniable. There was nothing more powerful than the bond of family. And for I, this moment was the culmination of years of searching and fighting for a loved one who had been lost. I could see I's determination in that moment. She had come to terms with the fact that, at some point, she might never see her brother again. But against all odds, she had found him. As she gently rocked him in her arms, her gaze never left his face. She was grateful, but there was also a sense of sorrow in her eyes. The years of experiments and suffering that Kale had endured were now a reality they both had to face, and that reality was not going to be easy to process. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, but in this moment, they had each other. And that was all they needed to begin the long, hard process of healing. As Kale began to stir, his eyes fluttering open with a pained, confused expression, I's smile was a mixture of joy and relief. It was clear that she was determined to help him recover, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The ordeal had only begun for them, but they had made it through the first hurdle, the most difficult one. They were together again, and that in itself was a victory. For me, watching them, the gravity of their journey weighed on my shoulders. This rescue was more than just a triumph of compassion. It was a reminder of the deeper truth that there was more at stake than just me, just my job, or even the risks involved. Helping I and Kale was about righting the wrongs of a system that had been built on exploitation, cruelty, and inhumanity. I had become a part of something bigger, something meaningful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had done something that mattered. The reunion between I and Kale was the beginning of their healing process, but it also marked the beginning of my own transformation, a shift from passive observer to active participant in shaping a better, more compassionate world. After the intense, life-changing event of rescuing Kale, the emotional journey for I, Kale, and myself was far from over. As the two siblings embraced, I stood by quietly, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. However, that was not the final chapter. I, who had spent years desperately searching for her brother, now had him back in her arms, but there was still so much more to be done. Their future together, now that they had reunited, would not be easy. There would be challenges ahead, healing from the trauma, facing the past, and finding a new path forward. But for the first time in years, I had hope. In this moment, I had witnessed the power of compassion, and I realized that my role in this reunion, though significant, was only one part of a larger story. After Kale was freed from the stasis chamber, I and her brother shared a brief but intense moment together. The connection between them was powerful, but I knew that their journey was just beginning. As the two of them exchanged words of comfort, there was an unspoken understanding between us all. The rescue had been the first step, but the true healing would take place in the quiet, personal moments that would follow, ones that neither I nor anyone else could be a part of. This was their time, their chance to reconnect, and I had played my part in facilitating that. But now it was time for me to step back. As I turned to me, there was a shift in the air, a moment of quiet recognition. She could never fully express the depth of her gratitude, but her eyes spoke volumes. She had come to me in desperation, seeking my help, and I had not only helped her find her brother, but also brought them back together. The weight of my decision to break the rules and defy the systems that had kept Kale imprisoned now felt right. I had questioned myself at many points during this journey, wondering if I had done the right thing, if I was putting everything on the line for the right cause. But looking at Ice's expression, seeing the joy and the relief in her eyes as she looked at her brother, I knew I had made the right choice. "I never thought you would go this far for us," I said quietly, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "You didn't have to do this, but you did." The words were simple, yet their weight carried so much more. The gratitude in her voice was raw, unfiltered, and genuine. She had known the risk she was taking by seeking my help, and yet she had chosen to trust me. Now, as she stood before me, her brother in her arms, I could see how much this act of kindness had meant to her. In response, I simply nodded, unable to find the words to express the emotions that swirled within me. There was a deep satisfaction in knowing that I had made a difference in their lives. But even more than that, there was a feeling of quiet humility. I hadn't saved them, at least not in the way that might be expected. I had simply made the choice to help when I could, and it was that simple act that had sparked this profound change in their lives. I was a small part of something much bigger, something much more meaningful. As I and Kale made plans to leave, I felt a sense of finality in the air. Their reunion had brought closure, but for me, it marked the end of a chapter one hadn't fully understood until now. I had given them back what they had lost, but I had also gained something. In helping I had helped myself to understand the power of connection, of trust, and of compassion. It was a realization that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The next morning, as I walked down the familiar street to work, I couldn't help but look towards the alley on Brilliam Street where I had first appeared. It was empty now, but there was a sense of peace in the quiet. I no longer felt the weight of loneliness or the sense of being lost in a world that felt disconnected. I and Kale's journey was far from over, but they were no longer alone, and neither was I. I had played my part in restoring their bond, and in doing so, I had restored a part of myself. The gratitude that I had expressed would stay with me, not just as a memory, but as a quiet, personal reminder of what it meant to truly help someone, to go beyond what was comfortable or convenient to do what was right. It wasn't about recognition or reward. It was about the connection, the deep, unspoken bond that was formed in the process of helping someone else heal. And as I walked on, I felt a sense of closure, knowing that the alley on Brilliam Street would always be a reminder of the day I helped bring a family back together, and in doing so, found my own place in the world. In this pivotal moment of the story, the protagonist experiences a profound shift in perspective. After helping I reunite with her brother, Kale, a series of reflections take place that go beyond the immediate act of rescue. This moment isn't just about the physical act of saving someone. It delves deeply into understanding the broader significance of what has transpired. As I and Kale embrace, the protagonist recognizes that their connection isn't limited to simply aiding in the search for her brother. It's part of something larger, a much more significant realization about the nature of compassion, personal choices, and the complex ties that bind people together across species, cultures, and experiences. At the core of this realization is the understanding that the protagonist has not just done a favor for I. They have engaged in a meaningful act that transcends the simple boundaries of right or wrong. The protagonist reflects on the impact of this act, acknowledging that they have done something that they never could have anticipated when they first encountered I. The moment of connection with I, of helping her find her brother, is more than just a selfless act. It becomes a catalyst for personal transformation. The protagonist realizes that the decision to help I and Kale was not just an external action, but a decision that profoundly changed their inner world. This is evident in the growing sense of purpose that washes over them during the rescue. It was no longer just about the job, the research facility, or the consequences of defying authority. It was about doing something meaningful. The protagonist is suddenly aware that their actions can have far-reaching implications, not just for themselves, but for others as well. They have bridged a gap, not just between two individuals, I and Kale, but also between species, between people, and between the emotional barriers that so often divide them. This realization marks a turning point in the protagonist's personal growth. Prior to this, they had been primarily focused on their own life, career, and survival in a world shaped by bureaucracy and rules. However, after aiding in Kale's rescue, the protagonist has come to understand the importance of empathy and compassion in a world that often feels impersonal and cold. This newfound awareness empowers the protagonist to recognize that their role in the world is not limited to mundane routines and obligations. They now understand that they have the power to create change, whether on a small, personal level or something much broader. The protagonist's growth can also be seen in the way they reflect on their decision-making process. Initially, they were hesitant to get involved, fearful of the consequences and the risks that came with breaking the rules. Yet, by the end of the ordeal, they see that their fear was misplaced. The outcome was not only positive but also life-affirming. The protagonist's ability to make a difference, to step out of their comfort zone and act with conviction, has led to the resolution of a significant conflict, and they now realize the strength in making difficult decisions that are rooted in doing what is right, rather than simply what is easy or safe. Furthermore, this new sense of purpose isn't simply about self-improvement or gaining satisfaction from helping others. The protagonist also learns that they are part of something larger than themselves. The shared struggle between Kale, and the protagonist becomes a reminder that in a world full of division, it is compassion and understanding that unite us. The protagonist comes to see that by helping they were also helping to heal a wound that was much bigger than any individual. It was a wound that extended across generations, cultures, and the harsh realities of war. This deeper understanding of interconnectedness makes the protagonist's journey not just about personal redemption, but also about contributing to a greater collective good. By the time and Kale leave, the protagonist is filled with a quiet sense of pride. They don't need to be publicly acknowledged or rewarded. The true reward lies in the internal transformation they've undergone. This realization underscores the central theme of the story, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can have the most profound effects. It's not the big, heroic moments that define us, but the quiet, courageous choices we make when faced with difficult decisions. The protagonist now walks away from the alley on Brilliant Street with a new understanding of who they are, how they relate to others, and what they're capable of achieving. The journey that started with uncertainty has led to a newfound sense of self and purpose, a realization that will stay with them long after and Kale have moved on. In the final moments of the story, after the protagonist has helped rescue her brother, Kale, the protagonist experiences a profound sense of closure. The alley on Brilliant Street, which had once been a place where they encountered for the first time, is now empty. The protagonist stands there, alone, yet the emotional weight of the entire experience lingers. For the first time in the story, the protagonist doesn't feel the isolation or loneliness they once did. This final scene is pivotal because it symbolizes both the end of a journey and the beginning of something entirely new, both for the protagonist and for the world they inhabit. The alley, which had previously been a place of quiet observation and mystery, now represents a turning point. Initially, it was where the protagonist first saw a figure who seemed strange, mysterious, and disconnected from their own life. The alley was a place where the protagonist's routine, ordinary life began to intersect with something extraordinary. As the protagonist walks through that alley each morning, they start to notice silent presence, which slowly pulls them out of their comfort zone, forcing them to confront not only their own emotional limitations, but also the larger, often painful truths about the world around them. Now, standing in the same place, the protagonist reflects on everything that has transpired. The journey with and Kale has taken them from a simple act of curiosity to a deep, life-changing commitment that altered their perception of themselves, the world, and others. The alley is no longer a space filled with unease or uncertainty. It has become a symbol of growth, change, and transformation. The protagonist's life, once mundane and self-centered, has been irrevocably changed through the bonds forged with and Kale. However, there is also a poignant sense of loss. While and Kale have gone on with their lives, the protagonist remains behind. The feeling of being alone once more is palpable, but it's different this time. They're not the same person who first walked into that alley days or weeks ago. They are someone who has been changed by the experience of helping and Kale, of uncovering the painful truths about the treatment of Zenari individuals during the war, and of standing up to powerful systems that operate in secrecy. The protagonist has grown stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of the complexities of the world around them. Even though and Kale are no longer physically present, the emotional bond created between them all is not something that simply fades with their departure. The protagonist is left with a deeper understanding of empathy and compassion that will remain with them throughout their life. This understanding extends beyond the immediate narrative. It becomes a guide for how they will approach future challenges and relationships. By helping find her brother, the protagonist has become part of a larger narrative, one that transcends individual actions and touches on universal themes of justice, connection, and healing. There is also a sense of reconciliation in this final moment. The protagonist's earlier hesitations, fears, and self-imposed boundaries have been confronted and overcome. In choosing to help they made a brave and unselfish decision. And while the consequences of their actions may not always be clear, there is a quiet peace that settles over them. The protagonist has confronted the emotional scars of the past, the fear, the hesitation, the guilt, and has emerged stronger. This journey was about much more than saving Kale. It was about finding strength within themselves to be a catalyst for change in a world where such acts of kindness are all too rare. The final lines of the story emphasize that while the physical journey may have ended, the emotional and psychological transformation the protagonist has undergone continues. The emptiness in the alley does not signify despair. Instead, it signifies the growth and understanding that the protagonist now carries with them. They no longer feel the sense of isolation they once did. The encounter with and Kale, their shared experience, and the act of compassion have reshaped the protagonist's identity in profound ways. They now understand that they are not alone, not just because of the relationships they've formed, but because of the deeper connection they share with the world. A connection rooted in empathy, shared humanity, and the courage to do what is right even when it's difficult. In conclusion, Point 10 serves as a reminder that the journey of personal growth is never truly over. The protagonist's experience with and Kale has not just solved a singular problem, but has propelled them into a future full of possibilities. Though the alley may remain empty, it symbolizes a life that has been irrevocably changed by the connections made with others. It is a place where an ordinary person became something extraordinary. Someone capable of compassion, bravery, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As the protagonist walks away, they do so with a renewed sense of purpose and belonging, knowing that while they may be alone in the physical sense, they are forever tied to the experiences and people they have encountered along the way.